morning, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well out there. Been a beautiful weekend thus far. First weekend of fall. It's a very nice time of year. Anyway, getting into the text for today, we're looking at the Gospel of Luke again, and chapter 16, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Remember that story? Well, if I tell it to you before I read it, it'd just get a little redundant there. But anyway, just to carry it where it's coming up in the conversation, it too is a parable that's directed against the Pharisees, and particularly their love of money. Last week's sermon, the parable of the dishonest manager or the shrewd manager, Jesus told that to his disciples within the hearing of the Pharisees, and it kind of in a way to explain to the Pharisees, not giving them the opportunity to talk about it, that God was taking the management of the kingdom away from them. And the reason being their love for money. The Pharisees, as you remember, were the legalists, very law observant, and the reason for being that way was they expected the Messiah to come at any time, and in the Messiah's kingdom, the law will be observed as if by instinct. And so if you want to get into that kingdom, you have to start observing the law now, or the law of Moses. They were an interesting lot. Along with their legalism came quite a bit of judgmentalism. They were probably the most, if I say popular, that won't be the right word, the most influential of the different types of Judaism back in that day, and Judah being under the control of the Romans. The Pharisees were, in a way, helping to keep things in line for Rome by being very dominant, whatever the word would be, by using the law to try to dominate the people, to keep them in line, as opposed to it really being about faith. And that's kind of what we'll talk about today. But looking here in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. Or is to be in Abraham's bosom, actually, is the right word there. In Jewish thought back then, the holding place for the good was, for the good of the Jewish people, was a place called Sheol, but in Sheol was a place called Abraham's bosom. Abraham, the father of the faith. You went there. It was a bit of a paradise. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. And the rich man, or to be in Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus at his side, and he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." The rich man said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." And Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And he said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, there's something that in that parable, and you might think it kind of trivial, but something that really piques my attention. A question as to why did Jesus give that poor beggar the name Lazarus? This is just a parable by which Jesus was addressing the Pharisees about their love of money and consequent neglect of the poor, and how that was disqualifying them from being the true descendants of Abraham, God's people, and they needed to repent. Now, Jesus could have just stuck with saying there was a poor man who daily sat begging outside a rich man's door. But instead, Jesus gives him the name of Lazarus. On top of that, he doesn't give the rich man a name. This is, interesting thing. Why? Obviously there must be something about that name, Lazarus, that informs this parable, adds to the meaning of the parable. I've got an idea about that, and so bear with me a minute, and I'll tell you what I think as to why Jesus uses this name, Lazarus. Well, right off the bat, some would say it was Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead in John's Gospel. After all, Jesus mentions someone being raised from the dead there in the last verse, but I don't think that's it. See, neither Luke nor Mark nor Matthew seem to know of that event for some odd reason. They do tell the story of Jesus raising a young man from the dead who was being carried through town and bringing great comfort to the guy's mother, but you don't get his name. It's more likely here that Jesus was referring to his own resurrection, which the Pharisees, who were responsible for his crucifixion, dismissed as a hoax. The name Lazarus, as it appears in our Bible, just to tell you about the name Lazarus is the Latinized version, as we get it in our English text. That's the Latinized version of the Greek name Lazaros, which is the Greekized version of the Hebrew name Eliezer, which means God has helped. In the Old Testament, the most famous Eliezer was the son of Moses' brother Aaron, who became the high priest for the people after Aaron died. Aaron was the first, and then he passed it on to Eliezer. And yes, a good many to most of the leaders of the Pharisees would have been from priestly families, albeit wealthy priestly families, and Jesus could have been alluding to Eliezer to remind them of their role among the people. But I don't think this Eliezer is the Eliezer Jesus was calling to mind for the Pharisees. He was definitely trying to remind them of something by mentioning this name. There's another more recent of living memory to the Pharisees, to Jesus' day, that's worth a long, hard squint, another Eliezer. But first I have to give you a little bit of armchair history so you understand where things are located. In Judea, during the mid-100s BC. The Greeks had been ruling in Judea there for about 150 years. And the leader of the Greeks at that time was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was one twisted, sick somebody. He sacrificed a pig in the temple, as well as put a statue of Zeus on the altar on which the Jews offered sacrifices. He burned Torah scrolls wherever he could find them, and he banned circumcision and any form of law observance. You could get arrested for that. His favorite pastime seemed to be publicly forcing law-observant Jews to eat pork or be tortured to death. It was just a game to him. During his tenure, says Antiochus Epiphanes, there arose a loosely configured resistance movement of faithful Jews known as the Hasidians, Chassidim. It's not really fair to say they were a resistance movement, though. Their devotion to keeping the law of Moses was due to their unwavering faithfulness to God. It was not simply a way of resisting Greek rule. We're going to keep the law just to make those Greeks angry. Antiochus, just for some reason, he hated their devotion to God. If they wanted to obey a law, was it a matter of philosophy or something? Okay, but they were doing it as faithfulness to a God. He just couldn't get that. Well, from among the Hasidians, the Chassidim, there arose the brothers Maccabeus, the Maccabees. You may have heard that name. They, in 167 BC, started a 3-year-long revolt that drove the Greeks out of Judea, resulting in a period of Jewish independence that lasted roughly 40 years until the Romans came along. The festival of Hanukkah arose out of that revolt. And oddly, the majority of the Jews at that time, they weren't exactly in with the Hasidians. They were what you would call Hellenistic Jews. They adopted the Greek way of life, just kept their heads down and kept their faith to themselves. The Hasidians, the Chassidim, were tortured for their faithfulness, while the Hellenists lived quite comfortably. And just so you know, a pretty convincing argument can be made that the Pharisees of Jesus' day traced their origins back to these very faithful Hasidians, the Chassidim, the faithful ones, the law-observant ones. But I think Jesus is trying to accuse them of acting like Hellenists, the comfortable Jews, who just put their head down and kept their faith to themselves. Well, the Hasidians had some key teachers among them there at the beginning, some very devoted men. One of them was an elderly scribe named Eleazar. He was probably in his 80s at the time of this revolt. There was a very well-known account of the day Eleazar and Antiochus Epiphanes met up. Antiochus, he quite respected Eleazar because he was wise. A very wise man. He had the ability to speak very eloquently. He's a very rational person. Antiochus respected rationality. It's just that he didn't understand why a rational person would keep such strict adherence to such a strict law out of devotion to a god, especially a non-Greek god. So he and Eleazar one day started to have the discussion as to why. Well, after a bit of debate, Antiochus just decided to get on with his hobby, with testing the old man's faith by threatening to have him tortured to death if he didn't eat a piece of pork. Well, they debated a little bit more on this, and then with a bit of reluctance, Antiochus had the guards take this 80-some-year-old man away to be flogged with a scourge. A scourge was a whip made with many straps on the end of it. It was very effective at ripping flesh open on the body. Turned you into a bloody mess quickly. Well, they stripped him naked, the guards did. They stripped him naked, tied, just to humiliate him, tied his hands, and commenced scourging him. And he stood there bravely and took it for longer than anyone expected. And eventually he fell to the ground. And the account of it says, it's just because of his age. He was too feeble to stand there with it anymore. And then one of the guards started kicking him in the side, trying to make him stand up. But he just couldn't, due to his age. Well, the guards soon started to feel ashamed of what they were doing to this old man, and stopped and started to plead with him to just, here, eat a piece of meat and say it's pork so that we can stop this. And they feel very bad about what they're doing, probably more bad about what they're doing than actually what Eliezer's going through. Well, Eliezer's answer was basically, why should he let his long life of faithfulness end in such an act of cowardice? Eat a piece of meat and pretend it's pork. What sort of an example would that set for the young? It would be more shameful to do that just to gain a few more days on earth, which he would spend just simply being mocked by everybody, particularly Antiochus. It would just cause Antiochus to lose respect for him. And at the end of what he had to say to the guards there, he said to the people, "O children of Abraham, die nobly for your faith. And you, guards of the tyrant, why do you delay?" And that's basically to point out they were ashamed of what they were doing. Maybe ought to do the right thing and just stop. But that's not what happened. The guards got on with it. They took whatever metal things they could find there around, made them red hot in a fire, and burned him to the bone all over his body. And then they poured stinking liquids into his nose. I don't know if that was sewage or if that was that stuff that you see boxers use to wake up, which can be pretty nasty stuff. Well, they did this, or while they did this, Eliezer looked towards heaven and said to God, O God, that though I might have saved myself, I'm dying in burning torments for the sake of the law. Be merciful to your people, and let our punishments," there were 7 brothers and their mother being martyred at that time too, "let our punishment suffice for them," the whole people. "Make my blood their purification, and take my life in exchange for theirs." And then he died. I tell you, there's some serious theology there. If you remember, when you're talking about the name Eliezer, it means God has helped. And though it may not seem that God helped Eliezer in this case, we do need to note that not long after his death, the brothers Maccabeus defeated the Greeks and drove them from the land. And for 40 years, the Jews enjoyed national independence. That was the last time that they would enjoy that until 1948. Well, Eliezer, Lazarus, suffered for his faith in God and his faithfulness to the law. Looking at the Pharisees there in Jesus' day, his theological descendants, there's a good scholarly argument to be made that the Pharisees trace their origins back to the movement of the Hasideans, of which Eliezer was a part. The Pharisees there in Jesus' day, Eliezer's descendants, they weren't like the Hasideans. As I said, they were like the Hellenists. The Pharisees were getting rich off of keeping the law and policing it. One could even say they were being tyrants about it in the way they were enforcing it, to the extent that they were persecuting their fellow Jews with the law. Actually, they were more like the Hellenist Jews in Eleazar's day than the Hasidians from whom they originated. I think Jesus used the name Lazarus here, Eleazar, in this parable to truly convict the money-loving Pharisees of their hypocrisy. See, Eleazar, he died for his faithfulness by being undeservedly tortured with flaming things. And if you noticed in the parable, the rich man in the parable was also being tortured with flaming things, the flames in Hades. The rich man was himself a Jew and should have gone to Abraham's bosom where faithful Jews went to await resurrection. But instead, here's this rich man, this rich Jew in Hades, the afterlife that the Greeks believed in, where he's being tortured with flaming things. And this because he deserved it. He was a self-absorbed money lover who neglected the poor, who sat right outside his door begging. Now, even in death, he thought that poor beggar Lazarus ought to be waiting on him. So it was with the Pharisees. They missed what it was that was truly at the heart of the law. The mercy that the rich man never showed to the poor man Lazarus, to Eleazar. And instead, they were using the law really just to make people serve them and to make their hunger for power, to satiate their hunger for power. Well, let me lighten the mood just a little bit, maybe. I hope. I knew an elderly man up until a couple of years ago when he died. He had been a banker by career. And we all make assumptions that bankers are wealthy. But with this man, you would never know if he was or he wasn't. He and his wife just really kept things pretty simple. He was a devoted Christian, devoted husband, devoted family man. And everywhere they lived, they moved around quite a bit throughout life. Everywhere they lived, they always found a church, attended that church, and got quite active in it. When I first met this man, he was treasurer of his church. He had me over to his house under the auspices of catching me up on the financial situation of the church. They tell you in seminary to beware of those people who show up at your door bearing cherry pies. When the treasurer calls you over in the first couple of weeks, you're going to be wondering why. Is something up here? He did want to catch me up on the financial situation, but the real reason was that he wanted to strike up a relationship with me, a friendship. He thought a minister ought to know his people and their struggles and pray for them. He wanted me to know that his wife had periods of illness, of losing her. And whenever she got sick and went to the hospital, he'd call me so that I could start praying for her. He was simply a faithful man. But I do have to admit about him, as he would admit it too, that after having lived separated from his wife through COVID after a bazillion years of marriage, COVID, she lived in one place in the nursing home and he in another, and he could only see her by looking through a fence and waving to her through a window. And then she died, and then his own health issues really got serious, and he had to live with some really serious, untreatable pain for his last 2 years. During all that, he was tempted to eat the pork, so to speak. He questioned God over it all, the suffering. And he was also anxious that I was going to take a call somewhere else. So I had to routinely assure him that I would not be taking a call away from there before he died. He could count on that I would be there to bury him. You see, number 3 on my list of reasons for not taking a call somewhere else is that there are so many of you folks just like him who've been faithful all your lives and deserve to be buried by someone who knows you. So many in my family didn't have that I don't know what to call it, blessing. This man was a faithful, humble, generous man. On a number of occasions in his last couple of years there, he had me over to talk about his funeral because he believed his death was imminent, or at least he hoped it was. When it came to what, if any, particular scriptures he wanted read at his service, he was adamant about one verse only. It was Micah 6:8. And it reads, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Well, this man I've been telling you about was Mac Elliott. And he passed away 2 years and nearly 2 months ago. Whenever I come across this story of Eliezer, which is more often than you would think, he is one who comes to mind. Mac knew what was at the heart of what God expects from humanity. To seek justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. Mac was faithful all his life. But his last several years had his faith really tested. But still he endured, a just, kind, humble man before God. And he's sort of a parable for so many churches today. Many small churches, such as our 4 churches today, are like Eliezer, Lazarus. Keeping the faith, keeping the doors open, keeping the lights on, though it seems pointless. On top of it all, the churches, that seem to be doing well, and you take a good look at them, they're part of these forms of Christianity these days that have been co-opted by Christian nationalism. And you find lurking under there, a hatred for immigrants, and really there's a lot of racism floating around in it. They don't do much for the poor because they think the poor should help themselves. That you've heard it said, the good Lord helps those who help themselves. Well, that verse is found nowhere in the Bible. Patriarchy, patriarchalism, if not outright misogyny, hatred of women, is blatantly there in these forms of Christianity. And at the root of what is sick in these, the popular form of Christianity today is basically just a love of money. To that I have to say to you folks, stay faithful, beloved of God. Continue to listen to Jesus, the one who was raised from the dead. The love, the friendship you have here is an embodiment of him. That counts for something. Keep the faith. Amen. I'm going to leave you with an old hymn, kind of makes for a good country music song anyway. as pants the heart. You folks have a good week, and God bless you. Amen. As pants the heart for cooling streams, when heated in the chase, so longs my soul, O God, for thee, and thy refreshing grace. For thee, my God, the living God, my thirsty soul doth pine. Oh, when shall I behold thy face, thou majesty divine? Why restless, why cast down my soul? Trust God who will employ sure aid for thee, and change these sighs to wakeful beams of joy. God of my strength, how long shall I, like one forgotten, mourn, forlorn, forsaken, and exposed to my oppressor's scorn? Why restless, why cast down my soul? Hope still, and thou shalt sing praise to thy God, the living God, thy health's eternal spring. As pants the heart for cooling streams, when heated in the chase, so longs my soul, O God, for thee, and thy refreshing